Welcome to my channel and today's soft-spoken story, The King's General by Daphne du Maurier. Chapter 1. September 1653. The last of summer, the first chill winds of autumn. The sun no longer strikes my eastern window as I wake, but turning laggard does not top the hill before 8 o'clock. A white mist hides the bay sometimes until noon, and hangs about the marshes too, leaving, when it lifts, a breath of cold air behind it. Because of this, the tall grass in the meadow never dries, but long past midday shimmers and glistens in the sun, the great drops of moisture hanging motionless upon the stems. I notice the tides more than I did once. They seem to make a pattern to the day. When the water drains from the marshes, and little by little the yellow sands appear, rippling and hard and firm, it seems to my foolish fancy, as I lie here, that I too go seaward with the tide, and all my old hidden dreams that I thought buried for all time are bare and naked to the day, just as the shells of the stones are on the sands. It is a strange, joyous feeling, this streak back to the past. Nothing is regretted, and I am happy and proud. The mist and cloud have gone, and the sun, high now and full of warmth, holds revel with my ebb tide. How blue and hard is the sea as it curls westward from the bay, and the blackhead, darkly purple, leans to the deep water like a sloping shoulder. Once again, and this I know is fancy, it seems to me that the tide ebbs always in the middle of the day, when hope is highest and my mood is still. Then, half-consciously, I become aware of a shadow, of a sudden droop of the spirit. The first clouds of evening are gathering beyond the Dodman. They cast long fingers on the sea, and the surge of the sea, once far off and faint, comes louder now, creeping towards the sound. The tide has turned. Gone are the white stones and the cowrie shells. The sands are covered, my dreams are buried, and as darkness falls, the flood tide sweeps over the marshes and the land is covered. Then Mattie will come in to light the candles and to stir the fire, making a bustle with her presence. And if I am short with her or do not answer, she looks at me with a shake of her head and reminds me that the fall of the year was always my bad time, my autumn melancholy. Even in the distant days when I was young, the menace of it became an institution, and Mattie, like a fierce clucking hen, would chase away the casual visitor. Miss Honor can see nobody today. My family soon learnt to understand and left me in peace, though peace is an ill word to describe the moods of black despair that used to grip me. Oh well, they're over now, those moods at least. rebellion of the spirit against the chafing flesh, and the moments of real pain when I could not rest. Those were the battles of youth, and I am a rebel no longer. The middle years have me in thrall, and there is much to be said for them. Resignation brings its own reward. The trouble is that I cannot read now as I used to do. At 25, at 30, books were my great consolation. Like a true scholar, I worked away at my Latin and Greek, so that learning was part of my existence. Now it seems profitless. A cynic when I was young, I am in danger of becoming a worse one now I am old. So Robin says, poor Robin. God knows I must often make a poor companion. The years have not spared him either. He has aged much this year. Possibly his anxiety over me. I know they discuss the future, he and Matty, when they think I sleep. I can hear their voices droning in the parlour. But when he is with me, he feigns his little air of cheerfulness, and my heart bleeds for him, my brother, looking at me as he sits beside me, coldly critical, as I always am towards the people I love. I note the pouches beneath his eyes, and the way his hands tremble when he lights his pipe. Can it be that he was ever light of heart and passionate of mind? Did he really ride into battle with a hawk on his wrist? And was it only 10 years ago that he led his men to Braddock Down, side by side with Bevel Grenville, flaunting that scarlet standard with the 3 gold rests in the eyes of the enemy? Was this the man I saw once in the moonlight, fighting his rival for a faithless woman? Looking at him now, it seems a mockery. My poor Robin, with his greying locks shaggy on his shoulders. Yes, the agony of the war has left its mark on both of us. The war and the Grenvilles. Maybe Robin is bound to Gertrude still, even as I am to Richard. We never speak of these things. Ours is the dull drab life of day by day. Looking back, there can be very few amongst our friends who have not suffered. So many gone, so many penniless. I do not forget that Robin and I both live on charity. If Jonathan Rashleigh had not given us his house, we should have had no home, with Lanreth gone and Radford occupied. Jonathan looks very old and tired. It was that last grim year of imprisonment in St. Mawes that broke him, that and John's death. Mary looks much the same. It would take more than a civil war to break her quiet composure and her faith in God. Alice is still with them and her children, but the feckless Peter never visits her. I think of the time when we were all assembled in the long gallery, and Alice and Peter sang, and John and Joan held hands before the fire. They were all so young, such children. Even Gertrude, with her calculated malevolence, could not have charged the atmosphere that evening. Then Richard, my Richard, broke the spell deliberately with one of his devastating, cruel remarks, smiling as he did so, and the gaiety went and the careless joy vanished from the evening. I hated him for doing it, yet understood the mood that prompted him. Oh, God confound and damn these Grenvilles, I thought afterwards, for harming everything they touch, for twisting happiness into pain with a mere inflection of the voice. Why were they made thus, he and Gertrude, so that cruelty for its own sake was almost a vice to be indulged in, affording a sensuous delight? What evil genius presided at their cradle? Bevel had been so different, the flower of the flock, with his grave courtesy, his thoughtfulness, his rigid code of morality, his tenderness to his own and to other people's children, and his boys take after him. There is no vice in Jack or Bunny that I have ever seen, but Gertrude, those serpent's eyes beneath the red gold hair, that hard, voluptuous mouth. How incredible it seemed to me, even in the early days, when she was married to my brother Kit, that anyone could be deceived by her. Her power to charm was overwhelming. My father and my mother were jelly in her hands, and as for poor Kit, he was lost from the beginning, like Robin later. But I was never one, not for a moment. Well, her beauty is marred now, and I suppose forever. She will carry that scar to the grave, a thin scarlet line from eye to mouth where the blade slashed her. Rumour has it that she can still find lovers, and her latest conquest is one of the Careys, who has come to live near her at Bidford. I can well believe it. No neighbour would be safe from her if he had a charm of manner, and the Careys were always presentable. I can even find it in my heart to forgive her, now that everything is over. The idea of her dallying with George Carey, she must be at least 20 years the elder, brings a flash of colour into a grey world. And what a world! Long faces and worsted garments, bad harvests and sinking trade, everywhere men poorer than they were before, and the people miserable. The happy aftermath of war. Spies of the Lord Protector, God, what an ironic designation, in every town and village, and if a breath of protest against the state is heard, the murmurer is borne straight away to jail. The Presbyterians hold the reins in their grasping hands, and only men to benefit are upstarts like Frank Buller and Robert Bennet, and our old enemy, John Robarts, all of them out for what they can get, and damn the common man. Manners are rough, courtesy a forgotten quality. We are each one of us suspicious of our neighbour. Oh, brave new world! The docile English may endure it for a while, but not we Cornish. They cannot take our independence from us, and in a year or so, when we have licked our wounds, we'll have another rising, and there'll be more blood spilt and more hearts broken. But we shall still lack our leader, our Richard, my Richard. What evil spirit in you urged you to quarrel with all men, so that even the king is your enemy now? My heart aches for you in this last disgrace. I picture you sitting lonely and bitter at your window, gazing out across the dull flat lands of Holland, and putting the final words to the defence that you are writing, and of which Bunny brought me a rough draft when he came to see me last. Oh, put not your trust in princes, not in any child of man, for there is no help in them. Bitter, hopeless words that will do no good and only breed further mischief. Sir Richard Grenville, for his presuming loyalty, must be, by a public declaration, defamed as a bandito, and his very loyalty understood a crime. However, seeing it must be so, let God be prayed to bless the king with faithful counsellors, and that none may be prevalent to be any way hurtful to him or to any of his relations. As for Sir Richard Grenville, let him go with the reward of an old soldier of the king's. There is no present use for him. When there shall be, the council will think of it, if not too late. Valet. Resentful, proud, and bitter to the end. For this is the end, I know it, and you know it too. There will be no recovery for you now. You have destroyed yourself forever, feared and hated by friend and foe. The king's general in the west, the man I love. It was after the Skillies fell to the Parliament, and both Jack and Bunny were home for a while, having visited Holland and France, that they rode over from Stowe to see the Rashleys at Menabilly, and came down to pay their respects to me. We talked of Richard, and almost immediately Jack said, "My uncle is greatly altered. You would hardly know him. He sits for hours in silence, looking out of the window of his dismal lodging, watching the eternal rain. God, how it rains in Holland! And he has no wish for company. You remember how he used to quip and jest with us and with all youngsters. Now, if he does speak, it is to find fault, like a testy old man, and to crab his visitor. The king will never make use of him again, and he knows it," said Bunny. "The quarrel with the court has turned him sour. It was madness to fan the flame of his old enmity with Hyde." Then Jack, with more perception, seeing my eyes, quickly said, "Uncle was always his own worst enemy. Honour knows that. He is damnably lonely, that's the truth of it, and the years ahead are blank." We were all silent for a moment. My heart was aching for Richard, and the boys perceived it. Bunny said in a low tone, "My uncle never speaks of Dick. I suppose we shall never know what wretched misfortune overtook him." I felt myself grow cold, and the old sick horror gripped me. I turned my head so that the boy should not see my eyes. "No," I said slowly. "No, we shall never know." Bunny drummed with his fingers on the table, and Jack played idly with the pages of a book. I was watching the calm waters of the bay, and the little fishing boats creeping round the Blackhead from Gorenhaven. Their sails were amber in the setting sun. If, pursued Bunny, as though arguing with himself, he had fallen into the hands of the enemy, why was the fact concealed? This is what always puzzles me. The son of Richard Grenville was a prize indeed. I did not answer. I felt Jack move restlessly beside me. Perhaps marriage had given him perception. He was a bridegroom of a few months' standing at that time. Or maybe he was always more intuitive than Bunny. But I knew he was aware of my distress. There is little use, he said, in going over the past. We are making honour tired. Soon after they kissed my hands and left, promising to come and see me again before they returned to France. I watched them gallop away, young and free and untouched by the years that had gone. The future was theirs to seize. One day the king would come back to his waiting country, and Jack and Bunny, who had fought so valiantly for him, would be rewarded. I could picture them at Stowe and up in London at Whitehall, growing sleek and prosperous, with a whole new age of splendour opening before them. The Civil War would be forgotten, and forgotten too the generation that had preceded them, that had fallen in the cause or had failed. My generation, which would now enter into no inheritance. I lay there in my chair, watching the deepening shadows, and presently Robin came in and sat beside me, inquiring in his gruff, tender way if I was tired, regretting that he had missed the Grenville brothers, and going on to tell me of some small bother in the courthouse. I made a pretense of listening, aware with a queer sense of pity how the trifling everyday events were now his one concern. I thought how once he and his companions had won immortality for their gallant and so useless defence of Pendennis Castle in those tragic summer months in '46. How proud we were of them, how full of our hearts. And here he was rambling on about 5 fowls that had been stolen from a widow in St. Blaise. Perhaps I was no cynic after all, but rotten with sentiment. It was then that the idea came first to me that by writing down the events of those few years, I would rid myself of a burden. The war and how it changed our lives, how we were all caught up in it and broken by it, and our lives hopelessly intermingled one with another. Gertrude and Robin, Richard and I, the whole Rashleigh family, pent up together in that house of secrets. Small wonder that we came to be defeated. Even today, Robin goes every Sunday to dine at Menabilly, but not I. My health pleads its own excuse. Knowing what I know, I could not return. Menabilly, where the drama of our lives was played, is vivid enough to me 3 miles distant here. The house stands as bare and desolate as it did when I saw it last in '48. Jonathan has neither the heart nor the money to restore it to its former condition. He and Mary and the grandchildren live in one wing only. I pray God they will always remain in ignorance of that final tragedy. 2 people will carry the secret to their grave, Richard and I. He sits in Holland, many 100 miles away, and I lie upon my couch, and the shadow of the buttress is upon us both. When Robin rides each Sunday to Minnabilly, I go with him in imagination across the park and come to the high walls surrounding the house. The courtyard lies open. The west front stares down at me. The last rays of the sun shine into my old room above the gatehouse, for the lattice is open, but the windows of the room beside it are closed. Ivy tendrils creep across it. The smooth stone of the buttress outside the window is encrusted with lichen. The sun vanishes, and the west front takes once more to the shadows. The Rashleys eat and sleep within, and go by candlelight to bed and to dream. But I, down here 3 miles away, wake in the night to the sound of a boy's voice calling my name in terror, to a boy's hand beating against the walls, and there in the pitch black before me, vivid, terrible and accusing, is the ghost of Richard's son. I sit up in bed, sweating with horror, and faithful Mattie, hearing me stir, comes to me and lights the candle. She brews me a warm drink, rubs my aching back, and puts a shawl about my shoulders. Robin, in the room adjoining, sleeps on undisturbed. I try to read a while, but my thoughts are too violent to allow repose. Mattie brings me paper and pen, and I begin to write. There is so much to say, and so little time in which to say it, for I do not fool myself about the future. My own instinct, quite apart from Robin's face, warns me that this autumn will be the last. So while my Richard's defence is discussed by the world and placed on record for all time amongst the archives of this 17th century, my apologia will go with me to the grave, and by rotting there with me, unread, will serve its purpose. I will say for Richard what he never said for himself, and I will show how, despite his bitter faults and failings, it was possible for a woman to love him with all her heart and mind and body, and I that woman. I write at midnight, then by candlelight, while the church clock chimes the small hours, and the only sound I hear is the sigh of the wind beneath my window, and the murmur of the sea as the tide comes sweeping across the sands to the marshes below St. Blaise Bridge. Chapter 2. The first time I saw Gertrude was when my eldest brother, Kit, brought her home to Lanrest as his bride. She was 22, and I, the baby of the family except for Percy, a child of 10. We were a happy, sprawling family, very intimate and free, and my father, John Harris, cared nothing for the affairs of the world, but lived for his horses, his dogs, and the peaceful concerns of his small estate. Lanrest was not a large property, but it lay high amidst a sheltering ring of trees, looking down upon the Lue Valley, and was one of those placid, kindly houses that seemed to slumber through the years, and we loved it well. Even now, 30 years after, I have only to close my eyes and think of home, and there comes to my nostrils the well-remembered scent of hay, hot with the sun, blown by a lazy wind, and I see the great wheel thrashing the water down at the mills at Lamerton, and I smell the fusty, dusty, golden grain. The sky was always white with pigeons. They circled and flew above our heads, and were so tame that they would take grain from our hands. Strutting and cooing, puffed and proud, they created an atmosphere of comfort. Their gentle chattering amongst themselves through a long summer's afternoon brought much peace to me in the later years, when the others would go hawking and ride away laughing and talking, and I could no longer follow them. But that is another chapter. I was talking of Gertrude as I saw her first. The wedding had taken place at Stowe, her home, and Percy and I, because of some childish ailment or other, had not been present at it. I was undoubtedly spoiled, being so much younger than my brothers and sisters, who made a great pet of me, as did my parents too. But I had it firmly in my mind that my brother's bride did not wish to be bothered with children at her wedding, and that she feared we might have some infection. I can remember sitting upright in bed, my eyes bright with fever, remonstrating with my mother. When Cecilia was married, Percy and I carried the train, I said. Cecilia was my eldest sister. And we all of us went to Mother Combe, and the Polyexphans welcomed us, although Percy and I both made ourselves sick with overeating. All my mother could say in reply was that this time it was different, and Stowe was quite another place to Mother Combe, and the Grenvilles were not the Polyphexons, which seemed to me the most feeble of arguments, and she would never forgive herself if we took the fever to Gertrude. Everything was Gertrude. Nothing else mattered. There was a great fuss and commotion, too, about preparing the spare chamber for when the bride and bridegroom should come to stay. New hangings were brought, and rugs and tapestries, and it was all because Gertrude must not be made to feel Landrest was shabby or in poor repair. The servants were made to sweep and dust, the place was put into a bustle, and everyone made uncomfortable in the process. If it had been because of Kit, my dear easy-going brother, I should never have grudged it for a moment. But Kit himself might not have existed. It was for Gertrude, and like all children, I listened to the gossip of the servants. It's on account of his being heir to Sir Christopher at Radford that she's marrying our young master, was the sentence I heard amidst the clatter in the kitchens. I seized upon this piece of information and brooded on it, together with the reply from my father's steward. It's not like a Grenville to match with a plain Harris of Lanrest. The words angered me and confused me too. The word plain seemed a reflection on my brother's looks, whom I considered handsome, And why should a Harris of Lanrest be a poor bargain for a Grenville? It was true that Kit was heir to our Uncle Christopher at Radford, a great barracks of a place the other side of Plymouth, but I had never thought much of the fact until now. For the first time I realized, with something of a shock, that marriage was not the romantic fairy legend I had imagined it to be, but a great institution, a bargain between important families, with a tying up of property. When Cecilia married John Pollexiphan, whom she had known since childhood, it had not struck me in this way, but now, with my father riding over to Stowe continually and holding long conferences with lawyers and wearing a worried frown between his brows, Kit's marriage was becoming like some frightening affair of state, which, if worded wrong, would throw the country into chaos. Eavesdropping again, I heard the lawyer say, "It is not St. Bernard Grenville who is holding out about the settlement, but the daughter herself. She has her father wound round her finger." I pondered over this a while, and then repeated it to my sister Mary. "Is it usual," I asked, with no doubt irritating precocity, "for a bride to argue thus about her portion?" Mary did not answer for a moment. Although she was 20, life had barely brushed her as yet, and I doubt if she knew more than I did, but I could see that she was shocked. "Gertrude is the only daughter," she said after a moment. "It is perhaps necessary for her to discuss the settlements." "I wonder if Kit knows of it," I said. "I somehow do not think he would like it." Mary then bade me hold my tongue, and warned me that I was fast becoming a shrew, and no one would admire me for it. I was not to be discouraged, though, and while I refrained from mentioning the marriage settlement to my brothers, I went to plague Robin, my favourite even in those days, to tell me something of the Grenvilles. He had just ridden in from hawking and stood in the stable yard, his dear, handsome face flushed and happy, the falcon on his wrist, and I remember drawing back, scared always by the bird's deep, venomous eyes and the blood on her beak. She would permit no one to touch her but Robin, and he was stroking her feathers. There was a clatter in the stable yard, with the men rubbing down the horses, and in one corner by the well the dogs were feeding. "I am pleased it is Kit and not you that has gone away to find a bride for himself," I said, while the bird watched me from beneath great hooded lids, and Robin smiled and reached out his other hand to touch my curls, while the falcon ruffled in anger. "If I had been the eldest son," said Robin gently, "I would have been the bridegroom at this wedding." I stole a glance at him and saw that his smile had gone, and in its place a look of sadness. "Why did she like you best?" I asked. He turned away then, and placing the hood over his bird, gave her to the keeper. When he picked me up in his arms, he was smiling again, Come and pick cherries, he said, and never mind my brother's bride. But the Grenvilles, I persisted, as he bore me on his shoulders to the orchard. Why must we be so mighty proud about them? Bevel Grenville is the best fellow in the world, said Robin. Kit and Joe and I were at Oxford with him, and his sister is very beautiful. More than that I could not drag from him, but my brother Joe, to whose rather sarcastic, penetrating mind I put the same question later in the day, expressed surprise at my ignorance. Have you reached the ripe old age of 10, Honour? He inquired, without knowing that in Cornwall there are only 2 families who count for anything, the Grenvilles and the Arundels. Naturally, we humble Harris brood are overwhelmed that our dear brother Kit has been honoured by the august hand of the so ravishing Gertrude. Then he buried his nose in a book, and there was an end of the matter. The next week they were all gone to Stowe for the wedding. I had to hug my soul in patience until their return, and then, as I feared, my mother pleaded fatigue, as did the rest of them, and everyone seemed a little jaded and out of sorts with so much feasting and rejoicing, and only my 3rd sister Bridget unbent to me at all. She was in raptures over the magnificence of Stowe and the hospitality of the Grenvilles. This place is like a steward's lodge compared to Stowe, she told me. You could put Lanrest in one pocket of the grounds there, and it would not be noticed. 2 servants waited behind my chair at supper, and all the while musicians played to us from the gallery. But Gertrude, what of Gertrude? I said with impatience. Wait while I tell you, she said. There were more than 200 people staying there, and Mary and I slept together in a chamber, bigger far than any we possess here. There was a woman to tend us and dress our hair, and the bedding was changed every day and perfumed. What else then? I asked, consumed with jealousy. I think father was a little lost, she whispered. I saw him from time to time with the other people, endeavouring to talk, but he looked stifled, as though he could not breathe, and all the men were so richly attired, somehow he seemed drab beside them. Sir Barnard is a very fine-looking man. He wore a blue velvet doublet slashed with silver the day of the wedding, and father was in his green that fits him a little too well. He overtops him too, Sir Barnard I mean, and they look odd standing together. Never mind my father, I said. I want to hear of Gertrude. My sister Bridget smiled, superior with her knowledge. I liked Bevel the best, she said, and so does everyone. He was in the midst of it all, seeing that no one lacked for anything. I thought Lady Grenville a little stiff, but Bevel was the soul of courtesy, gracious in all he did. She paused a moment. They are all auburn-haired, you know, she said with some inconsequence. If we saw anyone with auburn hair, it was sure to be a Grenville. I did not care for the one they called Richard, she added with a frown. Why not? Was he so ugly? I asked. No, she answered, puzzled. He was more handsome than Bevel, but he looked at us all in a mocking, contemptuous way, and when he trod on my gown in the crush he made no apology. You are to blame, he had the impudence to tell me, for letting it trail thus in the dust. They told me at Stowe he was a soldier. But there is still Gertrude, I said. You have not described her. And then, to my mortification, Bridget yawned and rose to her feet. Oh, I am too weary to tell you any more, she said. Wait until the morning. But Mary and Cecilia and I are all agreed upon one thing, that we would sooner resemble Gertrude than any other woman. So in the end, I had to form my own judgment with my own eyes. We were all gathered in the hall to receive them. They had gone first from Stowe to my uncle's estate at Radford, and the dogs ran out into the courtyard as they heard the horses. We were a large party, because the Pollexfens were there with us too. Cecilia had her baby Joan in her arms, my first godchild, and I was proud of the honour, and we were all happy and laughing and talking because we were one family and knew one another so well. Kit swung himself down from the saddle. He looked very debonair and gay, and I saw Gertrude. She murmured something to Kit, who laughed and coloured and held his arms to help her dismount, and in a flash of intuition I knew she had said something to him which was part of their life together and had naught to do with us, his family. Kit was not ours any more, but belonged to her. I hung back, reluctant to be introduced, and suddenly she was beside me, her cool hand under my chin. So you are Honor, she said. The inflection in her voice suggested that I was small for my age, or ill-looking, or disappointing in some way, and she passed on through to the big parlour, taking precedence of my mother with a confident smile, while the remainder of my family followed like fascinated moths. Percy, being a boy and goggle-eyed as Beauty, went to her at once, and she put a sweetmeat in his mouth. She has them ready, I thought, to bribe us children as one bribes strange dogs. Would Honor like one too, she said, and there was a note of mockery in her voice, as though she knew instinctively that this treating of me as a baby was what I hated most. I could not take my eyes from her face. She reminded me of something, and suddenly I knew. I was a tiny child again at Radford, my uncle's home, and he was walking me through the glass houses in the gardens. There was one flower, an orchid, that grew alone. It was the colour of pale ivory, with one little vein of crimson running through the petals. The scent filled the house, honeyed and sickly sweet. It was the loveliest flower I had ever seen. I stretched out my hand to stroke the soft velvet sheen, and swiftly my uncle pulled me by the shoulder. "Don't touch it, child. The stem is poisonous." I drew back, frightened. Sure enough, I could see the myriad hairs bristling, sharp and sticky, like 1,000 swords. Gertrude was like that orchard. When she offered me the sweetmeat, I turned away, shaking my head, and my father, who had never spoken to me harshly in his life, said sharply, "Honor, Where are your manners?" Gertrude laughed and shrugged her shoulder. Everyone present turned reproving eyes upon me, and even Robin frowned. My mother bade me go upstairs to my room. That was how Gertrude came to Lanrest. The marriage lasted for 3 years, and it was not my purpose now to write about it. So much has happened since to make the later life of Gertrude the more vivid, and in the battles we have waged, the early years loom dim now and unimportant. There was always war between us, that much is certain. She young and confident and proud, and I a sullen child, peering at her from behind doors and screens, and both of us aware of a mutual hostility. They were more often at Radford and Stowe than at Lanrest, but when she came home, I swear she cast a blight upon the place. I was still a child, and I could not reason, but a child, like an animal, has an instinct that does not lie. There were no children of the marriage. That was the first blow, and I know this was a disappointment to my parents, because I heard them talk of it. My sister, Cecilia, came to us regularly for her lying in, but there was never a rumour of Gertrude. She rode and went hawking as we did. She did not keep her room or complain of fatigue, which we had come to expect from Cecilia. Once my brother had the hardihood to say, "When I was first wed, Gertrude, I neither rode nor hunted, for fear I should miscarry." And Gertrude, trimming her nails with a tiny pair of scissors made of mother of pearl, looked up at her and said, "I have nothing within me to lose, madame, and for that you had better blame your son." Her voice was low and full of venom, and my mother stared at her for a moment, bewildered, then rose and left the room in distress. It was the first time the poison had touched her. I did not understand the talk between them, but I sensed that Gertrude was bitter against my brother, for soon afterwards Kit came in, and going to Gertrude, said to her in a tone loaded with reproach, "Have you accused me to my mother?" They both looked at me, and I knew I had to leave the room. I went out into the garden and fed the pigeons, but the bees was gone from the place. From that moment everything went ill with them and with us all. Kit's nature seemed to change. He wore a harassed air, wretchedly unlike himself, and a coolness grew up between him and my father, who had hitherto agreed so well. Kit showed himself suddenly aggressive to my father and to us all, finding fault with the working of Lanrest and comparing it to Radford. And in contrast to this was his abject humility before Gertrude, a humility that had nothing fine about, but made him despicable to my intolerant eyes. The next year he stood for Westlow in Parliament, and they went often to London, so we did not see them much. But when they came to Lanrest, there seemed to be this continual strain about their presence, and once there was a heated quarrel between Kit and Robin one night when my parents were from home. It was midsummer, stifling and warm, and I played truant from my nursery and crept down to the garden in my nightgown. The household were abed. I remember flitting like a little ghost before the windows. The casement of the guest chamber was open wide, and I heard Kit's voice, louder than usual, lifted in argument. Some devil interest in me made me listen. "It is always the same," he said, "wherever we go. You make a fool of me before all men, and now, tonight, before my very brother. I tell you, I cannot endure it any longer." I heard Gertrude laugh, and I saw Kit's shadow reflected on the ceiling by the quivering candlelight. Their voices were low for a moment, and then Kit spoke again for me to hear. "You think I remark nothing," he said. "You think I have sunk so low that to keep you near me and to be allowed to touch you sometimes, I will shut my eyes to everyone. Do you think it was pleasant for me at Stowe to see how you looked upon Anthony Dennis that night when I returned so suddenly from London? A man with grown children and his wife scarce cold in her grave. Are you entirely without mercy for me?" That terrible pleading note I so detested had crept back into his voice again, and I heard Gertrude laugh once more. "And this evening," he said, "I saw you smiling across the table at him, my own brother. I felt sick and rather frightened, but curiously excited, and my heart thumped within me as I heard a step beside me on the paving, and looked over my shoulder. I saw Robin stand beside me in the darkness. "Go away," he whispered to me. "Go away at once." I pointed to the open window. "It is Kit and Gertrude," I said. "He is angry with her for smiling at you." I heard Robin catch his breath, and he turned as if to go, when suddenly Kit's voice cried out loud and horrible, as though he, a grown man, was sobbing like a child. "If that happens, I shall kill you. I swear to God, I shall kill you." Then Robin, swift as an arrow, stooped to a stone, and taking it in his hand, he flung it against the casement, shivering the glass to fragments. "God damn you for a coward, then," he shouted. "Come and kill me instead." I looked up and saw Kit's face, white and tortured, and behind him with Gertrude with her hair loose on her shoulders. It was a picture to be imprinted always on my mind, those two at the window, and Robin, suddenly different from the brother I had always known and loved, breathing defiance and contempt. I felt ashamed for him, for Kit, for myself, but mostly I was filled with hatred for Gertrude, who had brought the storm to pass and remained untouched by it. I turned and ran, with my fingers in my ears, and crept up to bed, with never a word to anyone, and drew the covers well over my head, fearing that by morning they would all three of them be discovered slain there in the grass. But what passed between them further I never know. Day broke, and all was as before, except that Robin rode away soon after breakfast, and did not return until after Kit and Gertrude took their departure to Radford some 5 days later. Whether anyone else in the family knew of the incident, I never discovered. I was too scared to ask, and since Gertrude had come amongst us, we had all lost our old manner of sharing troubles and each one of us grown more polite and secretive. Next year, in 23, the smallpox swept through Cornwall like a scourge, and few families were spared. In Liskeard, the people closed their doors, and the shopkeepers put up their shutters and would do no trade for fear of the infection. In June, my father was stricken, dying within a few days, and we had scarcely recovered from the blow before messages came to us from my uncle at Radford to say that Kit had been seized with the same dread disease, and there was no hope of his recovery. Father and son died within a few weeks of one another, and Joe, the scholar, became the head of the family. We were all too unhappy with our double loss to think of Gertrude, who had fled to Stowe at the first sign of infection and so escaped a similar fate. But when the two wills came to be read, both Kit's and my father's, we learnt that although Lanrest with Radford later passed to Joe, the rich pasture lands of Lamington and the mill were to remain in Gertrude's keeping for her lifetime. She came down with her brother Bevel for the reading, and even Cecilia, the gentlest of my sisters, remarked afterwards with shocking surprise upon her composure, her icy confidence, and the manner in which she saw to the measuring of every acre down at Lamerton. Bevel, married himself now and a near neighbour to us at Killygarth, did his utmost to smooth away the ill feeling that he sensed among us. And although I was still little more than a child, I remember feeling unhappy and embarrassed that he was put to so much awkwardness on our account. It was small wonder that he was loved by everyone, and I wondered to myself what opinion he held in his secret heart about his sister, or whether her beauty mazed him as it did every man. When affairs were settled and they went away, I think we all of us breathed relief that no actual breach had come to pass, causing a feud between the families, and the fact that Lanrest belonged to Joe was a weight off my mother's mind, although she said nothing. Robin remained from home during the whole period of the visit, and maybe no one but myself could guess the reason. The morning before she left, some impulse prompted me to hesitate before her chamber, the door of which was open, and look at her within. She had claimed that the contents of the room belonged to Kit, and so to her, and the servants had been employed the day before in taking down the hangings and removing the pieces of furniture she most desired. At this last moment she was alone, turning out a little secretaire that stood in one corner. She did not observe that I was watching her, and I saw the mask off her lovely face at last. The eyes were narrow, the lip protruding, and she wrenched at a little drawer with such force that the part came to pieces in her hands. There were some trinkets at the back of the drawer, none, I think, of great value, but she had remembered them. Suddenly she saw my face reflected in the mirror. "If you leave to us the bare walls, we shall be well content," I said as her eyes met mine. My father would have whipped me for it had he been alive, and my brothers too, but we were alone. You always played the spy from the first, she said softly, but because I was not a man, she did not smile. I was born with eyes in my head, I said to her. Slowly, she put the jewels in a little pouch she wore hanging from her wrist. Take comfort and be thankful you are quit of me now, she said. We are not likely to see one another again. I hope not, I told her. Suddenly she laughed. It were a pity, she said, that your brother did not have a little of your spirit. Which brother? I asked. She paused a moment, uncertain what I knew, and then, smiling, she tapped my cheek with her long, slim finger. All of them, she said, and then she turned her back on me and called to her servant from the adjoining room. Slowly I went downstairs, my mind on fire with questions, and coming into the hallway, I saw Joe fingering the great map hanging on the wall. I did not talk to him, but walked out past him into the garden. She left Lanrest at noon in a litter, with a great train of horses and servants from Stowe to carry her belongings. I watched them from a hiding place in the trees pass away up the road to Liskeard in a cloud of dust. That's over, I said to myself. That's the last of them. We have done with the Grenvilles, but fate willed otherwise. Thank you for listening to today's soft-spoken story. If you enjoyed the story, please like, comment and subscribe for more.